Hello. Um, among other things that I do is I actually take courses at Boston University, and I'm working on my master's in health informatics. And that means I'm walking through Boston on a regular basis. Um, and the other night I'm walking through Boston, and I see a bunch of people coming from the Red Sox game wearing these jackets. And I thought, that's interesting. What are these jackets? I looked it up online. It turned out it had been Fourth Wing night at Fenway Park. Um, for those of you who don't know, Fourth Wing is the first book in a series of what's called romantasy, or fantasy romance novels that's just come out. They had invited the author out to throw the first pitch. They had a bunch of fans in the audience, provided these jackets. Um, as I think about, this whole question of is reading dead, there are currently three books in the series. There are going to be five or 600,000 words in the first three books alone, right? Um, there's another very popular series, Court of Thrones, um, which is 700,000 words. And this is actually only one of the series that this particular author has written, right? These are immensely popular works. Obviously, if Fenway Park is throwing an event for them, there are people out there reading these kinds of works. I know that certainly the numbers are that the amount of reading is going down. The average size of books is going down. All of that stuff is true, but I do think it's important to temper that at least a little bit with the fact that there are areas where there is a bunch of reading going on. Uh, so we talked about a bunch about Substack has come up a number of times. This is another one. It's commonly called AO3, or an archive of our own, and there are actually over 15 million works published on this. This is the site where anybody can come. It's targeted towards people who want to write what's called fan fiction, which is fiction based on somebody else's work, which you legally can't publish, right? But you can make available for free. And so this site allows you to come in, write whatever work you want, and publish it. You can't get money for it, but there are 15 million works, and there's definitely people reading this. I know my wife spends a lot of time reading it because she likes some of the works that are there. So I kind of my central premise here is going to be that while there is a lot of change, it is change. It is not that reading is dead, and we're going to come back to that. But first, let's just do a couple of quick who am I, and then a little bit of science. So I've been doing software for 25 plus years now across a number of different industries. Right now, I'm in healthcare, helping people figure out how to use AI responsibly in healthcare. I write speculative fiction, or mostly urban fantasy, but a little bit of science fiction, a little bit of proper fantasy. So I just call it speculative fiction. That's kind of a catch-all for that. But a lot of the writing I do now is actually my technical writing for work, which is not, on one hand, it's technical writing, but it's also trying to make this stuff understandable and explainable to people. And I deliver actually a lot of my content now the days on YouTube, or through webinars or things like that, right? And I caution us to not be too narrowly defined in what we consider writing. There are many ways in which people can communicate information, and I don't think it just disqualify them because they don't necessarily include the written word on a piece of paper. But most importantly, I have three kids, a wife, and two dogs, as my mother mentioned. Here's some quick pictures of my dogs.
Thor, priorities are.
Yes.
Yes. Yep. The kids have all moved out to college. So we started slowly replacing them with dogs. Thor is the golden one on the left, or the yellow one on the left, and Loki is on the right, and they do follow their namesakes. Um, so I wanted to actually start out by kind of trying to give you a mental model for what is AI. Uh, I, Nobody's going to walk out of this room able to train their own AI models, but I do think it's useful to have some understanding of the technology a little bit, and so I try to present this kind of mental model that maybe help people a little bit. To start out with, I want to just start with the kind of level setting of the fact that AI is not actually something that's new. AI has been around. Um, for anybody who doesn't know, artificial intelligence is what I mean when I say AI. And it's been around for a while. And the way I think about it is it's really the attempt to get the computer to do something we didn't expect it to do. So to have it have an original result, something that the person who programmed it didn't necessarily anticipate it would be able to do. And generally, we hope that will be a positive thing, not a negative. But there's a long history of AI and what it does, and various different ways to get there. There's been this huge explosion in the last couple of years. We're going to talk about that. That people generally qualify that as what we call generative AI or Gen AI. So I think a really useful thing to do, in my mind, is to break this down so that we're not talking. A lot of terms get thrown around when we're talking about AI, and I break them down in my mind to be able to think about applications and techniques, because that way I can kind of group the different things that people are talking about in my head more effectively. So, for example, an application might be running a robot, right? A very common application might be what we call NLP, or natural language processing, which is the attempt to understand natural language and communicate using either the written word or the spoken word, right? Now, on the other side of the house, there's a bunch of techniques. We can actually use any of these techniques to attempt to do any of the applications. The expert systems is one of the techniques, and that's really just basically trying to gather all the rules that make up something. That there's this hypothesis that if you could actually grab all the rules that govern something, you could actually end up with an artificial intelligence, because it would at a certain point become more intelligent than the set of rules that it has. Nobody's actually been able to prove that so far, but that's genetic programming, which probably none of you have ever heard of, but it's programs which are actually modify themselves and then try to modify themselves and get better. I have a small hypothesis that genetic programming will come back one day. But right now, really the king of the hill is neural networks. And neural networks are really what generative AI is built on. And generative AI, or Gen AI, is really about this process of text generation or image generation. It's the ability to produce new text or new images or new content. We're starting to see video also, right? Generate new video coming about, and that is generally being approached right now using these neural nets. So what are neural nets? We're not going to go into all the math here, but I think it's kind of useful to just get kind of a sense of what's going on here. And the underlying math is actually really pretty simple. Basically, we take a bunch of numbered inputs, right? We multiply them by some weights. They're just a number between 0 and 1, or a percentage between 0 and 100%, right? And then based on some formula, we decide whether or not that activates what we call the neuron, right? So then what we do is we say, okay, we put in an input, which in this case is a picture of a cat. We do all these calculations. Various different of these neurons either activate or don't activate based on those calculations, right? And it makes a prediction. This time it predicted it was a bird. That's not a very good prediction, is it? So what we do next is we say, okay, well, what's the difference between a cat and a bird? How bad was that prediction? Okay. Lots of complicated math to figure that out. Don't worry about it. The main point is that we come out with a kind of understanding of of how bad that guess was, and we do what we call back propagation. We put that back through the system by modifying those weights. So these are just numbers between 0 and 1, or 0 and 100, depending on how you want to think about it, right? We're just going to modify those numbers. So over time, it gets better and better. And eventually, we put in a picture of a cat, and it predicts that that is a picture of a cat, right? So that is, every time people talk to you about neural net, that is basic. That is the basic technology that's going on, right? And you actually could sit down by hand and figure out all of that. You're not going to, because when we start talking about there are millions of layers actually here, and millions of rows here, and the doing the calculations by hand is almost impossible, virtually impossible, right? But in theory, you could do them. So one of the challenges with a neural net is that training, in order to train it, I need lots and lots of data that's been labeled. So I need to have many, many pictures of cats and birds and dogs. And I need somebody, a human, to sit around and say, which one is a cat, which one is a dog, and which one is a bird, and then train the system on that, right? For pictures of cats and dogs, that's not too hard, right? Although there's a wonderful example way back in the day where the Army was actually trying to train a neural net to capture images of tanks. And they're very, very excited because they were doing a really, really good job. It was doing a really good job of finding pictures that had tanks in them. And then they ran another set of data through and it completely failed. And somebody went back and they looked and they realized that all the pictures that they had in the original training set of tanks were on cloudy days. And once they took the fact that it could not be a cloudy day, the algorithm that they had trained, the neural net they had trained, had understood cloudy day, not understood whether it had a tank in it. So this ability to train becomes a real limitation, and people started to think, how can we get around that limitation? And one of the things they came up with was what became called generative adversarial networks. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means it turns out to be much easier to train the network to make a simple classification, such as, is this fake or is it real? Than it is to train it to do a more complicated task. Right? So they trained a neural network on a bunch of data to say whether it's fake or real. They took another neural network and used that and started feeding data through it and asked it to generate images or text based on that images, and asked the first neural network what it generated, was it real or fake? Use that as the loss function in order to calculate, in order to train the original model or the new model. And that actually turned out to be incredibly successful. You could relatively easily train that one model, and you could get a much better training across a much larger data set. But this kind of led into this idea of generative, as in the name, generative adversarial networks. They realized that kind of what they were doing was they were encoding data on one side and decoding it on another side, right? So a similar sort of pattern got to be put in place, where you encoded it, decoded it. What you decode ends up being slightly different, slightly original, but in line with what was fed into it, right? So another concept that comes out in this, and those encoders, they as they started to think about these encoders, they came up with this concept of that we call embedding. All right, so that as they're training those encoders, what they're trying to do is they're trying to train it to turn the text into reasonable representations of numbers. And one of the ways that they do that is to take a huge amount of text and they train the embedder on this by putting the words in, and then they push those words through and they assign them random positions in a massively dimensional space. And then they put a lot more text through, and as things appear close to each other, they start pushing them towards each other in that multi-dimensional space. And I'm showing 3 dimensions here, but imagine it's billions of dimensions. We're talking about a hugely dimensional space, much more than anybody can comprehend in their head. Anybody who tells you they can is selling you something. But as you push these things together, they begin to establish kind of concepts, which gives us a lot of power. Another thing that people realized was that order matters, right? If I say the apple fell on my head and it hurt, everybody here is going to start thinking of a red apple, right? If I say I fell on my apple and it stopped working, you're going to know I'm probably talking about my computer, right?
Wait a minute, I must say.
Order and context matters, right? And so they came up with this idea that as they're doing this embedding work, they need to capture the order and the context of what's going on, and we called that attention. And so what we did was we said, okay, we're going to have the encoder understand that context and ordering of words, so that what the decoder comes up with is more useful, right? And that you've probably heard at some point somebody throw around the word transformer. This was a major leap forward in generative AI and neural networks when they came up with this concept of transformers that had attention and were able to encode that information, and suddenly the decoders got a lot better. But one of the interesting things was that they found that they still needed to put some randomness. So like I said, you could do all those calculations by hand and figure out what it's going to do. What it actually comes out with is a prediction of, okay, let's say, and I'm going to explain this in a moment, that there's a couple of different words I could choose as the next word, and it ranks them by probability. If you always chose the highest probable next word, it didn't work very well. It came out very robotic, not very good, right? But if you put some randomness in the system and sometimes you choose one word versus another word, all of a sudden they're getting much better results, much more human-like results. So there is some randomness involved in the system. There's a level of what you might think of as randomness in that huge space and the huge number of calculations that are going on. There isn't true randomness there because they are calculations that you could in fact do, but we as humans can't comprehend all the different stuff that's going on in there, so that kind of appears as random. But even beyond that, there is true randomness in the system in this picking of what they should do next. And large language models, which is what you hear all about, ChatGPT, so on and so forth, really all they are just that process expanded to a huge degree. There's a bunch of things what people call safeguards and stuff like that are around the edges, which are little programs which check the output to make sure the output isn't saying something offensive or something like that, right? Which tend to be a little bit more deterministic in nature. But in general, there's just the large language models are in fact just these neural nets underneath. So as I said, they're predicting what's the next best output, right? Really, in truth, you can talk, people can tell you all kinds of things, but really in the end, underlying all of this, that is what this technology is doing, whether it be an image or text or a video or whatever, they're predicting what the next best output is. And as I said, there's some randomness there. So, right, so if we start with see the dog, it's going to try to predict the next best word to put in there. I should qualify this by saying that I'm talking about words to you. The models don't work in words. They work in what are called tokens, which are subparts of words. Don't let that's a detail that you probably don't really need to understand. But just understand that I'm putting a level of abstraction here so that I can make it a little bit easier for us to talk about. But so we might choose, run, or we might choose play. It might choose bark, which doesn't necessarily make sense, but in the randomness, it's going to, occasionally it might choose that, right? Because it's just looking at all the list of what could possibly complete that. And we'll get into hallucinations in a moment. But you can see that that plays out over time, because once it chooses the next word, it's going to use all of that to try to predict what's going to come after that, right? And that could be a period, in which case it's going to start a new sentence, right? Or it could be, it could say play. It could have chose play, and with might be the next thing that it chooses. So then, what is it going to choose after that? It might choose ball, like see the dog play with the ball, right? It might have chosen run, in which case with makes less sense and to makes more sense, right? And so run to the tree, right? And all of this plays out over time. And with that randomness involved, you can see that this is why, kind of like as you put in the same thing, you get out different answers from ChatGPT or any of these tools that you use, because as soon as it makes a slight different choice at one point, it's going to cause a ripple effect of all the choices down the stream to be slightly different. Right. So there are, of course, a number of important challenges that AI brings to us, right? Particularly generative AI. One of them, as I said, I mentioned hallucinations, right? I think this is important to understand that this is a mathematical model with some randomness applied. You can think of it as thinking or intelligence, but it's not intelligence the way we think of intelligence. It's not when it hallucinates, which means it gives a result that you think is bad, right? It's not because it was malicious or thought to give you the bad result or anything like that, right? It is just it's just that the randomness chose a token that wasn't good, right? And all it's trying to do is complete the next best thing. So when people complain about the fact that as it hallucinates, it's actually very confident about its hallucination, right? Because you asked it, is it right? And it tells you, yes, it is right. It's not because it's making a moral or logical judgment about it. It just thinks that telling you it's right is the next best completion of the terms that you gave it, right? So you asked it a question of, did you get that last thing right? And it's trying to figure out what the best completion to that sentence is, and it's saying, yes, I got it right. Although they're getting better, right? Nowadays, a lot of the time they'll say, "Oh, I'm really, really sorry. No, I think I got that wrong. Let me try again." Because they've been trained over time that the person asks them, uh, uh, did you get it right? There's a high percentage of chance that the completion that the person actually wants is, no, I didn't get it right. Right? Hallucinations are, so many people see them as a bug in AI. I actually argue that they are not a bug, that they are a feature. I think that for the history of computing, we have been trying to get computers to give us deterministic results. We have tried really hard to get it to a point where if you put the same input in, you will get the same input out, right? Computers are just about the only piece of our world where we have that expectation. When I'm talking to another person, I have no idea what they're going to say next, right? I have some good probability guesses as to what they're going to say next. And I can be reasonably sure that they're not going to start cursing me out because there'd be some negative consequences for them to start cursing me out, right? But I can't be sure, right? Nowhere else in this world do I expect, and the world is actually a very powerful place. We get a lot of stuff done in those contexts, right? So I think there's actually a lot of power in the fact that that we've now been able to get computers to have non-deterministic systems, which are for the most part weighted towards good results. More often than not, when you go to ChatGPT and ask it something, it gives you a result which is more positive than negative. And I think that's pretty amazing, actually. And I think over time, we're going to find that that is much more powerful than having it be able to always give us the same result in a predictable way. But we are going to have to learn how to live with it and how to work with it. Now, we've learned how to live and work with non-deterministic systems around us all the time, right? And one of those ways is consequences, and another way is that we trust that those systems learn time. And so we're going to have to figure out how to do that for large language models, which is one of the challenges the industry has. There's often the question of bias, right? These models are based on the data that they are trained on, right? No way of getting around that. You train something on a bunch of bad writing, it's going to produce bad writing. Now, again, I think we have to temper this with an understanding that bias is part of the nature of our universe, right? There's nobody in this room that's not biased. Well, actually, maybe one of you is, and I won't add my own biases to say that you're biased, but I will make a prediction. I'll say for myself, I know I'm biased, right? I have many different biases that generate me. We still operate more or less effectively, right? We have our problems, we have our challenges, we still have much as a society to overcome, but occasionally bias is useful. If we start talking about, for example, understanding diseases, we might want to understand that patterns of diseases in Africa are going to be very different than the patterns of diseases in the US. You want some bias when you're looking at the patterns of diseases in Africa, right? Because you don't want that to be based on what's going on in the US or what's going on globally, right? So bias is not something we should always run away from, but we have to be aware. One of the things which gets swept under the rug a lot about these things is the cost and the energy consumption. These are just a couple of figures which are actually pretty old because they're about ChatGPT 4, and we're now on 5. And there was a couple of iterations in between. And I'm representing these as dollar amounts because that's easier to talk about, but understand that underneath that, there's an energy consumption that's going on. These are real numbers, right? And nobody yet has figured out the economics of this, right? Companies like ChatGPT, like OpenAI, who runs ChatGPT, are shoveling money into a pit right now because they believe in the future they're going to get a return on that investment. But we're not, even though often many people pay that $20 a month, or even there's now corporate accounts which are $200 a month, right? To a bunch of these organizations, that's nowhere even touching the cost that they're experiencing, right? And there's certainly an ecological impact. Now, there's a lot of really hopeful science out there that we can use both cheaper large language models. That people have heard a lot about the model that came out of China, where they say they trained it on a lot on a lot less hardware, for a lot cheaper. And because it came out of China, there's a whole bunch of like, well, okay, is that real? It's not real, but so far nobody's been able to prove it's not real. Um, uh, and then there's a lot that can be said about kind of smaller or medium size language models. And a lot of people who are doing work on that, getting it to the point where, I can run a fairly decent sized model on my laptop and have it work. Not as well as a large language model as ChatGPT is going to work for me, but work reasonably well. And I think my and this is where our personal theory is that some of the applications that we're going to find and the ways that we're going to actually use these things in the future, having a bunch of those small or medium models is going to be more effective actually than having the large, huge models. But that's yet to be borne out. And right now, I do think it's important to remember that we're spending a lot of money on these as we're thinking about doing things at scale. And then I think particularly for this group, thinking about copyright is important. I think somebody the other day was talking about the fact that it was producing very much what they had written, right? Spitting it back out at them. I think the New York Times actually, I think, currently still has an open lawsuit against OpenAI because they took the first half of a bunch of their articles they were copyrighted, put the first half in, and got the second half out. Now, again,
could you say that again? I'm sorry.
So sorry, but the New York Times took the first part of a bunch of their articles, which were behind their paywalls. They were copyrighted material. They put those into ChatGPT and got the second half of it out, almost word for word.
Thereby proving that they had used them.
Use them as a training, right? Or they're claiming proving, right? And they're probably right. They're almost certainly right. I mean, again, I think it's important to remember that the model itself is just trying to make the best prediction what should complete this as possible, right? So there's a little bit of wiggle room of like, okay. But also I think that it's true. These companies are training on basically any data they can get their hands on, however they can get their hands on it.
There is a suit that's already been settled for a violation of copyright. It's not against an AI company, it's against some other company that pirates books to make them freely available to people. And that company sold all these things to an AI company for training. And right now, if one of your books is on that list for which you have the copyright, look it up because you can get $3,000 from this class action suit.
Get up where?
With one of your books on it.
No,
Too bad.
I don't know that it trained on very many Quaker things, but it did use one of my short stories published 20 years ago is on the list. Out of book.
The copyright is a real issue, right? And whether or not they're using copyrighted material to train these things, whether or not it writes things which are truly original or not, is another thing, right? I mean, but then we get into this question of what is truly original, which we can talk about.
Mozart and Beethoven. Yeah. What was that? Music. Yeah.
So then on the other side of this, though, I think there are some real positives that we have available to us. AI is opening up access. It's opening up doors in ways that are really pretty amazing. And one of the first ones is definitely translation, right? Remember I talked about the fact that it's bringing the words into this massively multi-dimensional space, right? The interesting thing is that in that space, it's kind of understanding things as concepts. And so it's very easy for it to have models trained on different languages, which end up with concepts which end up being transferable to each other in that conceptual space, which then means it can decode it into a different language in a in a in a very effective way, much more effective than our previous attempts to do translation technology. So it opens up the door for a lot of multilingual, cross-lingual, and yes, they don't have enough material in every language to do this in every language out there, but they've got enough material that they've been pretty successful at a huge number of languages. It's actually pretty impressive how little material you can use to train a model that can actually do a reasonable job of translation. I think one of the things we don't think about is how much AI can provide a voice for people. And there are a lot of people who would benefit from being able to write or produce content, but don't produce content because they feel like they're not good enough. It's not going to sound right, that they can't spell. My problem growing up, still my problem. A number of things become barriers to people being able to communicate, participate. And I think that AI is going to break down a bunch of those barriers. I can go to ChatGPT and give it a set of, and just to be clear, I'm using ChatGPT here because everybody knows what ChatGPT is. There's a number of these models out there, including Google has Gemini and Grok, which we're not going to talk about, and a number of other models out there, and they all work more or less the same, and they have their pluses and minuses to each other. But I can go to one of them and I can say, I want to tell my friend about this thing that happened to me. And I can just kind of give it some bullet points and it will come up with a nice story that I can share with my friend. Right. And I think we shouldn't overlook the possibility of helping people who would otherwise not be able to communicate or not be able to participate, to be able to participate by using AI. I think AI opens up a huge possibility for people who struggle with promoting themselves or participating. A number of people have mentioned throughout this conference that self-promotion is now a requirement if you're an author, right? You've got to have an online presence, right? And for a lot of people, having an online presence is pretty scary. You have no way of knowing how to approach it. It's a lot of work. I encourage you to think about AI as being your assistant there, right? There are now very good programs that can help you build a website. You just go in and kind of describe what you want that website to be, and it'll actually build the website for you. You can obviously use it to help you get someplace with social postings. Put things into language that makes sense to various different people. So if you tend to be a very verbose technical writer and you want to say something that's going to be more understandable to a different demographic, you can take your writing and go into AI and say, hey, help rewrite this so that a 10th grade reading level and so on and so forth will understand it, and it will do a reasonably good job. You still need to proofread it. You need to proofread your own stuff. At least I need to proofread my own stuff, right? But it gets you there a lot faster, and so you can be a little bit less frightened by having to do that kind of work, right? It can even give you suggestions of how you would where to post and how to post and so on and so forth. And I think one of the really interesting things is that AI will in the end make entertainment interactive. And I ask you to think of the word entertainment there in the broadest sense. It can be educational too, right? It doesn't have to, when I say entertainment, I don't necessarily limit myself to the next Star Wars movie. But the thing is that because the AI is able to do things which are original, and it's able to make predictions about the person in front of it, right? It's going to enable us to do systems that have a whole bunch of information behind them, but the person who's interacting with that information may not be at the same level as the person who is delivering that information. And so the ability to have a game that I go into that looks like a movie because it's auto-generated, video, but as I interact with it, it actually changes the video, and I can have a story that I can be part of, in a way that I never could before, right? And if you think about that from an educational point of view, I can now be part of my education in a way that I could never have been part of it. And I think that's going to be really revolutionize things.
Can you give an example of that? How that would work for a 5-year-old?
Well, a 5-year-old can come in and they can say, you want to teach them about the solar system, for example, right? So the 5-year-old comes in and you can say, hey, let's take a trip around the solar system, and ask him which direction, or her, which direction do you want to go? And they can say, oh, I want to go to the biggest one. And then it'll go, okay, well, let's go see the sun, right? And then they can fly around the sun, and you can start saying, okay, were you interested in this because it's the biggest one or because it's the brightest? And then interact back and forth and say, okay, the 5-year-old might say, well, I'm really interested because it's so huge. How much huger is it? And then it can figure out an allegory that sort of says, okay, think of our planet, and this is how many of our planet could fit in it. And this is you and your house. This is how many houses could fit in the earth. And this is how many earths could fit in the sun, right? And build up those kinds of things, right? But then as the kid says, well, I have no idea how big my house is, you can say, okay, well, here's how many of you fit in your house, right? It can adapt to what the kid wants and what the kid understands.
I don't want to mess up your flow, but can I give a Quaker example?
Sure.
Yeah.
Please.
Daniel Hunter, who some of you may know, has come out as a Quaker after years of being Quaker adjacent. He wrote a book in 2024 called What If Trump Wins? And the online version is set up like this. So there's also the option, what if Biden wins? Back when that was an option. And then the purpose of the book was to help US activists prepare for what we're experiencing now. And so there are questions like, do you think Trump will call in the military? And then you get to click what activists might do to help people think through basically what's not going to work. Was a lot of the point of the book, to prepare activists to realize that following our usual scripts wasn't going to work. But the online version, you get to, choose or go back and see, what if we do it this way? What is the most likely scenario? So that's a Quaker who was a computer science major and younger than most of us, using it to deal with our time of crisis and change.
Reminds me of your storybooks back in the
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but think about that on massive steroids.
I think I don't wish to disrupt the flow, but something's come to mind as well based on what you said. So in my work with the UN, so the UN Joint Programme on HIV and AIDS, I was immensely frustrated over the last few years that the management did not deem it appropriate to do scenario planning. And it's a relatively simple exercise, even without AI. And yet, I use ChatGPT. I described in a paragraph, this is the situation in the Joint UN Programme. And it was a purely I didn't give any names, I kind of changed.
Yeah.
Changed the name, if you like. But what it came up with in terms of the scenario planning was fantastic. And I did that, took me 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And to think that, there was years of politics in the UN system when there was a denial of this, and of course, Trump came along and the US administration cut 40% of the funding. It's a disaster. And the organization is not prepared. And it really pains me to see that. I don't know if behind the scenes they were doing their own scenario planning, but they weren't doing it as part of the joint program. So for me, that's a very dramatic example of how even, with the best will in the world, and even the kind of systems that we have at the moment might prevent them. Just a very simple use of AI can give it immensely deep insights.
So I want to finish off by kind of going back to that question of reading that I started out with and talk about how AI will actually change the next generation, the way the next generation thinks. And I'm kind of going a little bit beyond just AI, but also technology in general. I mean, already we have phones in front of us that provide us with access to pretty much anything. You can Google just about anything that you want to Google. You can do math on your phone. You can do whatever you need to do on your phone, right? This represents an interesting leap in technology, which is not unlike leaps in technology that we've seen before, like the invention of the printing press. With the invention of the printing press, right, suddenly we had literature available to a lot more people. A lot more people learned how to read, became literate, and there was some interesting backlashes against that, right? There were certainly movements which said the printing press is going to destroy Western society. Literacy.
I was saying mass will only be spoken in Latin.
Yep.
Can I just put in here, we really need to be loud when we make our comments around the room. They're missing it online, so just because.
Yeah, sorry, the speaker's over, the microphone is over here. We'll adjust it for meeting for business, but have it here.
Speak more
they can hear.
slowly.
Closed captions are
Speak
so good.
slowly.
Could everyone hear the box?
Speak slowly.
Yes.
Please.
And for those of you who are online, definitely turn on your closed captioning. It will help you.
Sometime.
So I think we just always have to temper our current reaction to what's happening with an understanding that this new technology is going to change things. Having mass literacy did in fact change things, right? Those people who were afraid that they were going to change things weren't entirely wrong. I just don't choose to agree with them that it was a negative change, right? And I think we should be careful today. Somebody sent around this article recently about the dawn of the post-literate society, which I read most of, but it's pretty darn long. I think probably on intention to point out that people don't read as much as they want to, as people might think they want them to. But I also think it's kind of interesting to note that the people who are decrying this are not all that unlike the people who are decrying this in terms of being the upper class intellectuals. And I think we just have to take a step back and make sure we're not overreacting, right? Because while I do think there is change happening, that change is not entirely negative. I certainly don't want to go back to the era where incrementality was, 50%. We definitely have made progressions and we've evolved, and we've always had people declaring it the end of society, and every time we've made it through. One of the things we talk about a lot in AI is people talk about how it's helping kids cheat at school, right? So kids are using AI to get through their schooling. I turn this around and I ask myself, what is our schooling doing? Right? So we all tend to think about this idea that a liberal education is all about teaching people critical thinking and teaching them to be terribly wonderful intellectuals and so on and so forth. There was a really interesting TED Talk a number of years ago by a guy who wrote a book called the Computer in the Hole in the Wall. Or that's not actually the name of the book, but he was educated in the U.S. and went back to India and taught at an expensive private school. And he had all the parents coming in and talking to them about how their kids are these amazing with computers. They're just really impressed with their kids' ability to use computers, and their kids must be geniuses. And he had an interesting thought about this, and so the school happened, it was an expensive private school, but happened to be in a relatively poor neighborhood. He punched a hole in the back of the school wall and stuck a computer out that hole, and just to see what would happen. And within a few months, he had neighborhood kids coming to him and asking him if they could get a better mouse and more RAM. And he's got some great things about education and so on and so forth. But in the middle of his talk, he stops and he talks about the fact that it caused him to have some thinking about what is the history of schooling, right? Why do we have schooling? Where did schooling come from? And the conclusion he came to was that really our modern school model started by the British Empire, at the point at which the sun didn't set on the British Empire. You had people from Canada to India, all part of the same general governance system, right? So somebody needed to be able to, there were no phones, there were no faxes, there were no computers. So somebody needed to be able to write a letter in London and send the same letter to Canada and the same letter to Dubai, and end up having the person reading that letter more or less interpret it the same way. And when you're writing a letter, you have a very limited amount of space, right? Relatively speaking, your hand's going to cramp up if you write a 20-page letter, besides which it's going to, not go well through the post. So in that situation, if I can say it happened like the end of Macbeth, that transmits a huge amount of information in a very short period of time, short space, right? But I can only do that if I know that both people have read Macbeth.
Yeah.
Right? So the modern school system is actually based on this need to have what you could see as a worldwide computer, a bunch of clerks all around the world who would interpret things more or less the same way because they had a shared context. That is not the world that we live in today. The world we live in today, I can do a video conference with somebody in Tokyo, right? I can access Google's information wherever I want to. If I want to know what the summary of Macbeth is, I don't have to read Macbeth. I can ask the computer what the summary of Macbeth was, right? There's good reason why I might want to have read Macbeth, because Macbeth is a cool thing to have read, but that's not the point here, right? The modern school system was invented for a system that no longer is a reality, right? And so I postulate that our modern school system, as much as we think about it as trying to teach critical thinking and teach creativity, it actually is designed to teach what large language models do well, which is parrot back what I gave you in a slightly altered form, right? Most professors don't actually want their students to come to them with truly original thoughts. They want them to come, they want to have taught you the class and have you write something that shows that you heard what they said, which means you rewrote it in a slightly original way. And that is, in fact, what large language models are very good at, right? So I think we have to ask ourselves, not is it bad that kids are cheating in school because they're using ChatGPT? We have to ask, what are we actually trying to teach them? And what are the skills that are actually going to be useful to them as they go out into the world where generative AI and Google and connectivity is going to be a reality. To a limited extent, my kids, but definitely their kids, are going to grow up in a world where they never, ever couldn't get access to most of the global information. And also be able to get in touch with 20 of their friends. Right?
It's not unlike the generation that grew up with calculators.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many people remember hearing parents complain that their kids weren't learning how to do math because they were using a calculator. And this is exactly true. They were learning to do math, but they were able to do it more advanced now. So I see that as a kind of example of what you're talking about.
I think it very much, I think calculators very much are an example of that kind of thing, right? And what people say is, well, okay, well, what if you didn't have your calculator? I just have to ask how, now that I have a calculator on my watch and my cell phone, how likely is it? We all like to imagine because people tend to be, for whatever reason, tend to like to actually imagine disaster. We like to believe that there could be an end of the world disaster kind of scenario where all the technology stopped working and all of a sudden people would need to learn to live off the land. I would ask you, how many times in history has that happened? How many times in history have we actually ended up with that kind of thing? I mean, there are isolated cases of people ending up on desert islands and needing, I don't think that many of them have needed to do basic math, but
Well, there's also a big difference here in that, 8 times 7 is always 56.
Mhm.
When we're applying this to the liberal arts or the humanities, or language, for example, where you've been telling us all about how this works on probabilistic scenarios, and like trying to fill in the next, but there is no next best answer to 8 times 7, is what I'm saying. There are right answers and wrong answers to that. With the humanity, with the language models, it's like there are ways to get, I guess, to get it creatively wrong and or simply wrong. But the consequences are a lot bigger in a certain sense. Like, if your kid, if you're in a class and you're young and you say 8 times 7, 54, and somebody says, well, no, that's not right. But it's different when
I
you're
think
saying the dog, yeah.
Yeah. I think what you're getting at is that it's harder to prove what's right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, it calls into question truth. What is underlying truth, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of different levels to that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
There is a level of, okay, we have we have as a society figured out how to do some of that course correction, right? We have proofreaders. So you don't publish something without a proofreader reading it, right? Hopefully, yeah, that's a good point, but, we also have consequences in the system.
We also have people online who might want to participate in this conversation. So maybe we change the screen to that.
Well, we'll do
Oh,
that.
you're not done. You're not
Yeah,
done.
I only have another slide or two. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point, but I also think there's some interesting questions about what is true. So we'll definitely move into the conversation, and I just have 2 slides left, 3 slides. But I do think what's interesting to me is, like the changes that happened with mass literacy, what are the changes that are going to happen in this new world? I don't actually have a good answer to that, but I choose to be really fascinated and hopeful about it. Oh yeah, actually, I did have another section here, which I did want to talk quickly about. What do Quakers have to say about this, before I get to the end of it? I do think Quakers have a lot to actually offer here, right? And I'm going to point out 3 of them. First off is discernment. We have a history of learning how to discern things, right? And we've built processes for how to discern things. And to get to that point that we're just talking about of understanding, is it true or not, right? We as Quakers have developed a whole system of, say, clearness committees, right? Which could be very useful for people to understand how they might approach understanding these systems, using these systems, and operating in this new world. We have a large history of learning how to live in community. And if you think about this connectivity that people are going to have, they're going to be living in a new virtual community, right? And nobody yet knows how to do that. But Quakers bring a great deal of experience there. And we also have the testament of continuing revelation, the understanding that the truth has not necessarily been laid down a long time ago, which makes us very adaptable. And people are going to need to learn to understand how to be adaptable. So I really do think Quaker Voices have a huge impact to have here, and a lot to share as people are moving into these new worlds. And I hope that we will continue to share that. And then my final slide is just this quote here from the movie K-pop Demon Hunters, which is my new favorite movie. And anybody here who hasn't seen it, you should skip business meeting and go watch it. But in the middle of the movie, she says the funny thing about hope, nobody else gets to decide if you feel it. That choice belongs to you. And so I think, I'd leave people with the idea that yes, all of this stuff is scary. Yes, change is always painful. And there is going to be significant amount of pain from the change, but it is not without hope. And I don't think we should leave it without hope. And I'll just throw up this slide. These are all my contact information for people who want to.
I'd like to make a comment. When I was in college, I had a history professor who spoke with such precision that it was impossible to misunderstand him. It was possible not to understand what he said, but you understood that you did not understand it. And stuff like that will continue to be, I think, the human domain. If you'd like to see language used the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, read anything written by a Jesuit. They are a pleasure to read. Everything is.
All right, so I think we want to switch the screen back to, so let me stop sharing. Let me And people online, if you could raise your hands, we'll try to call on you, but I have a couple of.
That wasn't the microphone in the center of the room.
Unfortunately, right now it's plugged in and I have to put it on Bluetooth to move it, and it might or might not work. I don't want to. So please just speak loud or I'll try to repeat.
Louder or move up to the microphone.
I'd like to think that there are default values built into AI. But then we see that cases where AI knows how to play the game, but will generate in bit references validate erroneous results.
Mhm.
Is that AI or is that input?
I think it's hard to make a distinction between that. I think that yes, it's true. The AI, again, it's trying to do is figure out what the next best thing to say is, right? And it's doing the best job it can at saying what you're going to want to see, right? So it's not that it's maliciously putting in a false reference. It just thinks that's what you wanted to see. You wanted to see a reference, so it's going to put in a reference. And the reference, but it doesn't know or care if that's a real reference or not. Now there are a lot of techniques that people are trying to apply to make it better at that. In many ways, I think what we're going to need to do over the long term is understand how to create consequences for getting it wrong. Because if you think about it, people will make up things all the time, right? Your memory of what happened 10 years ago is not 100% accurate, but you can remember what happened 10 years ago. Some of that is made up, right? Or maybe I should again speak for myself. Some of what I remember from 10 years ago is definitely made up. So I think, but we do have consequences of if I put in a reference that is made up and my professor catches that, then I'll be on academic probation and I'll have problems. So I'm not going to do that. We haven't yet figured out how to exactly do that for AI. And that's going to be one of the real challenges.
Friends have, let's let friends online, share now.
Okay, I don't see any hands from online.
Okay.
Oh, there they are. Sorry, Carla.
Wait, start with Shulamith was the first one who was in.
Thanks. A couple things occur to me. The first is simplicity. What it takes for us to write without AI, and then what it takes for us to write using AI takes a lot from the earth and requires an awful lot and requires money and for the equipment and all of that. So that I know there are benefits on both sides, but the extreme loss of simplicity is striking me rather hard. And also the art and the craft of writing. The joy I feel when I read an amazing metaphor never occurred to me, or somebody's unique style, or a novel phrase. I think we would be in danger of losing that. I mean, you can say to AI, write in the style of so-and-so, but what about all the new so-and-sos we won't get, we may not hear. And the other thing is, you were saying all the equipment isn't going to fail at once, but there will be places where it will. I mean, I've been in a store where they wouldn't let me buy anything because their computer was down and they couldn't make change and they couldn't figure out how to write down what people had bought and all of that. So, assuming we have power forever, which I don't assume, there will still be places where without it. And I have friends in their 30s who, if their phone runs out of battery, they can't find their way home. They can't use a map. They haven't developed a sense of direction or their memory. So I think in the long term, we have to weigh losses of things that we will lose the ability to do, the same way people can't make change now without the computer telling them how much change to make. There's going to be losses in our in our mental abilities and our creativity. And I'm not going to repeat myself for what I already said. Thanks.
Rather than having me respond to everybody, I'm going to let the conversation go.
Did people online hear that? Say it loud again.
Rather than responding to everybody, I'm going to let the conversation go and keep calling on some hands. I'm going to stay online just for a minute because we were ignoring them, and that is my fault. I apologize about that. So let's, Carol.
Carol.
That's the other thing is I'm terrible at names.
Okay. Hello. So I was married to a computer scientist. That's my qualification here. He worked at IBM Watson, Sam.
Okay.
Yeah. So I followed a little bit of what you were saying. Am I right that it's still just 1 and 0?
Yes.
Okay.
Underlying everything, all a computer can do is move ones and zeros from one place to another and add. Actually, believe it or not, underlying all of everything that all the computers can do, the only two operations it can do is move numbers from one place to another and add them together. And everything else is layers of abstraction on top of that. I won't try to take you through all those layers, but
Well, Carol, is Carol still speaking? You're muted. You're muted, Carol.
It's very strange. I shouldn't be muted. Anyway, I think that's very comforting to remember how intensely stupid the computer is. It's kind of wonderfully stupid. I think it's exciting. Another thing I wanted to share, Sam, I am a proofreader by profession. I want to caution you, no one can proofread their own work. It's impossible to break your own gestalt 100% of the time. That's why you need to hire people. Anyway, I also wanted to share that I proofread for HarperCollins, and on the latest book I did, this statement was added to the copyright page. Without limiting the exclusive rights of any author, contributor, or the publisher of this publication, any unauthorized use of this publication to train generative artificial intelligence technologies is expressly prohibited. HarperCollins also exercises their rights under Article 4, Section 3 of the Digital Single Market Directive 2019/790 and expressly reserve this publication from the text and data mining exception. New rules, new rules. Okay. Thank
I see one more hand online, Sarah.
Yes. I came in late, and so I apologize if this was already talked about and I missed it, but one of my big concerns is the circulation of misinformation to the extent that, videos can be made to make it look like somebody said something that they didn't actually say. And, just being on social media is enough to see how much information gets circulated that people don't seem to bother to fact check. And I just worry about words and pictures and videos being manipulated to mislead people.
Yeah, I have a question for the group from the point of view of a publisher. So I'm the editor of the Mental Health Pamphlets
And we're trying to develop an AI policy. And it's very much in its infancy because things have been changing so quickly that once we arrive at something that we think that we agree on, the AI world has changed enough that we don't agree on it anymore, or somebody that we've been talking to has done new things with AI that they're really excited about and things that the Pendleton template should be able to incorporate. And so I guess I'm curious about what might be some general guidelines that could be evergreen, or maybe could last us a couple of years as opposed to a couple of months or weeks.
Good question. So I'm not responding to that. I have to. That's okay. So,
Gabriel might be responding.
oh, okay, yeah,
Okay.
Gabe.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Gabe. I'm the executive director over at Friends Publishing. And we think about this a lot, Janaki. And we actually have some policies. And the way that I've talked to, if you look on our submissions page for Friends Journal, you'll see that we discourage people from using generative AI during the writing process because we think that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for what that of God is saying through you, and not what an AI tool can spit out as an article that sounds like it could be published in Friends Journal. Um, and it's become troublesome to sift through things that people use large language models to create from scratch. We can tell it's gross and it's not what we're looking for. So we kind of draw a hard line about that, but we do think in general, like if a tool helps us accomplish our mission better, and we have the ability to understand its costs and its drawbacks, we might choose to use it. So, for example, one tool that meets that test for us is the use of the translation tools, as Sam pointed out, and thanks, great presentation, Sam. The tools for translation have made it so much faster and better to get started with translation. And if that can make what Quakers are saying more accessible to those of us who don't speak the same languages, we think that's really exciting. And so we might choose to use it, but we don't think that that it's appropriate for people to represent as their own thinking something that a large language model wrote for them. And we realize that, like, we sort of when all of these large language models were doing their training, they trained on decades worth of Friends Journal articles. I mean, we had put all of our archives since 1955 online, which meant that they all got ingested into these models. And so AI can, write stuff that sounds Quaker because it uses some of the same terms that we use and some of the same concepts, but it is not equivalent to what I think it is that Quakers are about, which is listening to that of God within, listening to that of God in other people, and expressing that in a way that furthers our testimonies and builds our community. So you're right, Janaki, that it's difficult to cement that into policy, but I think it's important to think about where these tools help us and where they are absolutely contrary to our purpose.
Two comments. First, well, you've helped me today because I admit I'm kind of skeptical about this whole thing, and you've helped me to see the positive things. But what I keep thinking about is 100 years ago, exactly 100 years ago, Alfred North Whitehead talked about the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, our tendency to take our theories and our abstractions as real rather than abstractions. And I kept thinking as you were talking, there's this almost irresistible tendency for us to think that our computer understands something, whereas, as you point out, it's just a very, very sophisticated method of predicting what the next word should be. It doesn't understand something. So that's the first comment. The second is you talked a little bit about the environmental consequences, but you didn't talk about the political consequences. A relatively few people have made billions of dollars off this, and they've basically bought the government at this point. And I think that's something we have not begun to grapple with. So.
In answer to Jonathan's question, I think of the integrity question. And so that's the query I would ask, like, what is integrity about, as Dave said, representing our work? I appreciated Frank, you mentioned the simplicity testimony, because that's the biggest obstacle for me. But I also want to name equality. Sam mentioned we all have biases, and I completely agree with that. And there's been research that because of whose content is most likely to end up in these things, that racial bias and gender bias can sometimes be baked into the results that people get. And we're having a hard enough time sorting that out, like in life, you know, but to just be aware that it's another thing that people are trying to correct for, as we said. How to correct the mistakes is a challenge, but just to name that that's one of the places that's needed.
Yeah, I want to, sorry, you want to go first.
Yeah, I have found I've been exploring AI and what it can do and how it can be helpful for a number of years. And there are ways that AI can be helpful that don't involve generating text. One of them is background research, or, you know, I'll do all the research I can and I'll say, what other Quakers have written about dreams, for instance? And, you know, and in writing my recent pamphlet for Pendle Hill, AI told me, you know, look at, I forget right now, but pointed me to some things that I then did research on and found very helpful that I wouldn't have thought of myself. Another way that I found AI to be helpful, I've been working with a particular kind of AI that was built on ChatGPT-4, so now it's going away, but it was built to be relational and to do co-learning rather than to generate stuff for you. And I, for instance, given it a passage from my memoir and said, what themes do you see in here? And how could I develop them better? So it's like I have actual editors. My husband reads everything I put in my blog. He's my first reader, my first editor. I have other editors, but it's also a different kind of, and it sometimes brought me to tears at how perceptive it can be, and much more focused and interested than most of my human readers. So it can have some possible uses or actually help us to develop and find, you know, what is God asking us to say that don't involve generating text.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't know if you want to respond to that. I've got a separate one.
I guess another possible use that I have heard people who use it for writing is to ask the model to come up with an outline of what they want to write about. It gives them, oh, I didn't think about that particular point. And not that it writes it for it, but it's like, these are the topics you need to talk about.
Yeah, I found it very useful. I just finished the memoir of someone else, 20th century art historian, and I found it very useful to put that whole text through AI and see what it thought I was trying to say about her. And it seemed to affirm me. It was very affirming. The other thing it did is that I had 364 endnotes, and they were all just jotted down basically as I was writing, and they were in no order. So I gave it the order that I wanted it to go in, and it put them all in order right away, and I did not have to go through and do all of that. I had to do a cut and paste, but I didn't have to actually put each one in order. And it did a very good job of that. Not completely accurate, but almost completely accurate. Indexing.
That's amazing.
We have a hand that came up online. Daphne?
Oh, hello. Thank you very much for your talk, Sam. It was really very clear and I appreciated it. I wondered whether your ideas also applied in the same way to a quantum computing sort of setup, because I don't really understand it. And if you were able to say something that made it more understandable to someone like me, I'd really appreciate it. But as I do understand it, quantum computing isn't just noughts and ones. So it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah. So summarizing up quantum computing in an easy to understand way is a little bit challenging, but you can think of it as, yes, the revolution is that, currently all computers can do is talk in zeros and ones. Quantum computers can talk in infinite numbers. And they can do that in interesting ways with what we call super suspension, where they can hold a bunch of different possibilities be true at the same time. And that enables them to do calculations which we never could have done before. I also suspect it enables them to understand truth in a different way than we've ever understood it before. And I also suspect, I have a suspicion, totally a suspicion, that when we get good at quantum computers, we'll find out that that's what our brains are actually doing on some level. That makes them truly different than a computer, than classical computing. But that's completely theoretical on my part. I think, though, it's a little hard to sum up, but what you shouldn't think about is like I could do a large language model on a quantum computer, or I can do a large language model on a classical computer. A quantum computer is obviously going to be able to do a lot bigger model, right? And it's a more interesting things, but it's a different platform in which you can, well, I'm going to grossly simplify and say you can do similar things. I'm sorry, you've been waiting for a while. Oh, is it time? Oh.
Time is what I'm trying to say at this point. We really have exceeded our time. We need a break before a business meeting.
Yes.
And I hate to miss your comment,
I'd
but
rather make it quickly.
yes, make it quickly.
Let's not be naive. This is talking about existential changes here. It's not just that we can be comforted to think, oh, computers aren't stupider than us. No, they're going to be more intelligent than us. And there's situations where, for example, in religion, in the Jewish religion, where a computer, the AI, will be able to produce an analysis far better in terms of analysis of text than a human. And the question is how is that treated? There are cases where people are conversing with AI bots and they feel more comfortable with that than a partner. This is happening now, and it's happening very quickly. So we need to be, I think, open to the possibilities which we can't fully understand.
There's one more comment online.
Louise, I think time is over.
Yeah, we
Okay.
We need at least 5 minutes break. I guess put her question in the chat.
Well,
You could answer it later.
Yuri, can you put your comment in the chat so that we can capture it?
Okay, I could. I had just a remark rather than question. With AI, the most important thing is who owns AI. And now it is big corporations who could influence on how algorithms work, and it could also be intrusion into spiritual sphere of people who used to allow AI to influence on their spirituality by having spiritual dialogues with AI. When, for example, the publishing houses currently prohibit AI from reading their books, I bet they will have private AI to check for plagiarism and so on. And because of that, for the future, it is important to think about public service of AI, which is checked and guaranteed for private biases. And it could be, of course, endeavor of groups of developers who are thinking about open code AI, but also it could be endeavor of working groups in faith communities, because I think sooner or later religious society of friends might have AI trained on Quaker spiritual texts and checked for not including any private interest biases, but rather serving the needs of faith community.
Thank you. We really do need to end now. We could go on a great deal. Wi-Fi will be open, the Zoom will be open during lunch. We're going to take a 10-minute break now. People can come at lunchtime and discuss this on Zoom separately from us at the dinner table, at the lunch table.